All right, let's go ahead and begin today. My name is Kent Messer. I'm one of the co-directors of CBEAR, and it is my pleasure to do the initial introductions for today's CBEAR seminar series. As many people know about CBEAR, what we're about, where we're active throughout the country, we are happy to have been supported by the USDA since 2014 and been named a Center of Excellence. We continue to do our work in a non-political way, really to work for ways that improve programs, support evidence-based policy, and look at ways of embedding behavioral insights into federal programs, because they've been shown to be effective. And what we're really interested in is talking about how they can be tested within programs and to help move all of this research area and important work forward. Today, we're just have a couple of housekeeping things. That we're going to use the chat feature. So we'll have those monitored, and Mark Masters will be doing his excellent Q&A sessions later on today. And we do ask that everyone will remain muted throughout that, but we'll have the chats be able to ask Paul questions throughout. So, as we move on, I want to do first an introduction to our person who's doing the introduction to Paul, and that's for Spiro Stefanou. And he's been a colleague to us for many of us for many years. And for a lot of us, our interactions came through his outstanding service to our field as a past editor of the AJE and the Applied Economics Perspectives and Policy. Spiro has had a long and a distinguished academic career at Penn State University, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and the University of Florida. He was a AAEA fellow. And, it's not probably a surprise that he has now moved on to a very prestigious position as administrator of the USDA Economic Research Service. And so we very much appreciate Spiro beginning this introduction and being here with us today. So Spiro, I'm going to just pass it on over to you.
Well, thank you, Kent, and thanks for the opportunity to offer some opening remarks. The Economic Research Service has three core assets. We have a human capital base that's unrivaled in terms of breadth and depth in the field. We have data products, nearly 80 publicly available data products and others non-publicly accessible, and a set of 6 core models addressing environmental, food, national, and global economic analyses. So we leverage these 3 assets to engage in research that anticipates trends and emerging issues in agriculture, food, the environment, and rural America. And we engage in high quality, objective economic research to inform and enhance public and private decision-making. Now, ERS is very pleased to co-sponsor this seminar today by Professor Paul Ferraro, who is with us to present on the core of how we do research and how it can be generalized to the larger population. Research must be replicable if it is to be reliable. And in an evidence-based policy informing environment, the reliability of research findings is the coin of the realm. So ERS is a data-driven research agency. As I mentioned, we invest heavily in data products, and we make a practice of confronting economic theory with the data. So we want to learn more about the practical aspects of replicability, and as a matter of best practices, what do we need to keep in mind going forward? So we often are facing questions that need a quick response. In this environment now, in particular, it's quite fast-paced for us at ERS, and speed can be an enemy of accuracy and reliability. So how do we deal with these issues in a serious fashion? So I will not take up more of Paul's presentation time. Again, we appreciate the opportunity to learn from the extensive body of evidence he has constructed to address this critical trend and how we engage in science. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to Professor Ferraro.
Thanks, Spiro, appreciate that. And I'm surprised that Kent Messer did not share an anecdote of the first CBEAR ERS presentation that I did that had exactly 0 participants. It was Dan Hellerstein, myself, and a mountain of sandwiches that went uneaten despite our best efforts. So it's great to see so many people showing up for this talk, and I'm looking forward to giving this talk. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I think there's a bunch of nuggets in here that would be great for the discipline and for our applications if they could be adopted. So this is joint work with Pallavi Shukla, who's also at Johns Hopkins University. And I think the first slide that Ken showed had about replicability in agro-environmental research, which I think is a typo. We're looking at agricultural economics broadly here. And there's a question mark at the end of the title, because I'm not going to show you that things are not replicating in agricultural economics. Instead, I'm going to show you what I think are fingerprints of research practices that we've known for a long time are problematic, that still are widespread and pervasive in our discipline and are problematic given how applied our discipline is and how much we want to influence policy and real world outcomes. So before I get into that, I want to do the disclaimers. So the first one, make sure everybody knows that these are my views and not to be attributed to ERS or the USDA. And I also want to emphasize that the empirical results I'm showing are preliminary. We're still adding more data, but we've got over 250 studies, over 2,000 estimates.
Join the meeting.
If you want to see the pre-analysis plan, there's the website there. It'll be at the end as well. And this is being recorded, so you can always go back and take a look at it if you want more details. All right, so I think people have heard by now of the replicability crisis and in lots of scientific disciplines, and econ is no exception. I am not actually going to talk about replicability. I'm not going to get into what do we mean by that? What's the definition? How do we know if a study replicates or not? Like, what should we expect? Instead, I'm going to focus on the practices that people believe are leading to this crisis in a variety of disciplines. And I don't want to get into the magnitude of the crisis, but that there are a variety of practices, behaviors that we engage in as researchers and scientists, whether we're in academia or in government agencies or NGOs, that are debatable of whether or not they actually are improving science. And really, it's fundamentally about incentives. We're economists. We know that incentives matter. And this is a debate about the professional incentives that we face. And I think it shouldn't be surprising to you that you can summarize in a nutshell that we face incentives to deliver results that make everybody say, wow, something that says that my research matters. And in practice, the way things play out is we are incentivized to deliver large, statistically significant effect sizes and clean answers to multiple questions in a single study. By clean, I mean there are no rival explanations except the explanation I'm giving as the author in the article. And again, Dan Hellerstein sent me an email saying, are these really new ideas? They aren't in some respects, right? We've been talking for decades in economics about specification searches and this idea that we select particular specifications that are favorable to the arguments we're making. And I'm sure before Lemur's article in 1984, there were other articles making the same points. But a lot of Lemur's article was about identification and misspecification. And so a lot of the citations to this are part of the credibility revolution in economics, talking about how to eliminate bias and identify causal effects. He wasn't really talking about questionable research practices exactly like selective reporting or harking, hypothesis after results are known. So his solution was systematic sensitivity analysis. And I'm going to be talking about solutions that are quite different from that one. And the other feature of Lemur's article, as well as those that followed, is that there wasn't really any empirical evidence of the extent to which these practices are widespread in the discipline. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, what Pallavi and I are working on. So we're not the first to discuss these questionable research practices or promote these solutions that I'm going to be discussing at the end, but we're trying to show through empirical evidence that there are these fingerprints in the recent ag econ publications from top journals that suggest we still have serious incentive problems. And that these, despite we've been talking about it for decades, these problems have not gone away. All right, so what exactly did we do? All right, so we've created a database with the help of undergraduates of over 20,000 test statistics from about 250 published agricultural economics papers between 2017 and 2020, and this is growing, this database. And we took them from AJE, Agriculture Economics, Food Policy, and Ag Econ publications in the AER. These are test statistics related to parameter estimates that are being reported and discussed in the main part of the analysis. Right? So we're not picking up on control variables that are never discussed or things that are in the appendices that are robustness checks. And we did the following. First thing we did is characterize the statistical power and the exaggeration bias in these studies. And I'll explain what I mean by exaggeration bias. And we're using the methodology from Leonidas and colleagues in the Economic Journal publication that they presented. Then we're assessing the evidence for selective reporting of statistically significant results using the methodology of Brodeur and colleagues from AER. We're going to show the number of studies in these journals that are engaged in multiple hypothesis testing and the share of those studies that correct for false discovery rates. And we're in the process now of conducting a survey on research practices among agricultural economists, asking them to self-report their use of particular research practices. If you haven't gotten an email about that through the AAEA, you can go to Pallavi or my Twitter feed, and one of the recent posts has a link to this survey. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you could fill that survey out. All right, so what do we find? What do we find? So the first conclusion is that agricultural economics publications are largely underpowered. Right? And that feature leads to unreliable estimated effects in the literature. And what do I mean quantitatively? In our preliminary analysis to date, the median power of the tests in our sample was 36%. Just going to minimize this so I can see my slides. And as you know, convention dictates that statistical power should be over 80%. Fewer than a third of the tests that in the publications achieve the 80% power threshold. Happy to discuss during Q&A again how that Leonidas method goes about proposing what the likely true effects are that the studies are seeking. But the punchline is that using the literature itself, the effect sizes that we're seeking are relatively modest in size, and the designs that we're using to detect those effects are underpowered. Right? But despite the low power of these designs, most of the published studies in our sample report statistically significant results. And this is just a concrete example. I looked at the first 3 issues of AJAE in 2019, and I counted 25 empirical studies that had at least one causal effect estimated using experimental or observational data. In almost all of them, the authors report a policy relevant and statistically significant estimate for the average effect, with many also reporting policy relevant and statistically significant subgroup effects. So how can it be that our designs are underpowered, yet we're producing statistically significant results? Let me just give you an example of a referee report that Steve Wallander and Nate Higgins used to be at ERS. Steve is still there. And I got when we tried to publish a field experiment that was embedded in the Conservation Reserve Program. So this is a real world agro-environmental program, tens of thousands of participants that were in the experiment. We estimated 3 different treatment effects. And the reviews said this, the editor summarizing. Reviewer 3 finds the small or no impacts of the treatment to reduce the contribution of this paper. And it doesn't warrant being published in AJE because the effect sizes were small. And reviewer 1 and 2 would also like to see more exploration of the types of farms and regions where treatment had a bigger impact. We're basically getting encouragement to find something more interesting in the data. I can give you a dozen referee reports with the same sort of advice, and wouldn't be surprising if people already anticipate these kind of referee reports and start thinking about their data analysis with that in mind. And as I'm going to talk about later, there's nothing wrong with doing exploration of your data to see what might be there that's interesting. The problem tends to be is that we write it as if we're seeking to find something and then we actually find it, rather than saying, I'm just doing an exploratory analysis. Let's see what I find, and maybe future research can look into this in more depth, because exploratory research isn't rewarded in our field. Confirmatory, predefined research is rewarded, as it is in most of science. All right, so I'm going to skip this slide because I just gave you an example of harking. So underpowered designs are problematic because of the unreliable estimated effect sizes that come out of them, but it gets worse when there's also publication biases against statistically significant results. All right, so think about this, that if we're trying to estimate an effect size that's about 1/10 of a standard deviation, and our design is only powered to detect 1/5 or 1/4 of a standard deviation, and it's underpowered to detect the effect that's likely to be there in the data, then the only way we're going to get a statistically significant result is if we estimate an effect size that's twice or larger than the actual true effect size. It's going to be exaggerated. And so when underpowered designs meet publication bias, it means that when we look in the literature, the magnitudes of what we're seeing are likely to be exaggerated. And given that we're an applied field, magnitudes matter, right? And so that even if there really is something there, but we're grossly overestimating its effect, that's problematic for our field. And using the Leonidas methods, we estimate that more than 1/3 of the reported effects are exaggerated by a factor of 2 or more, and an additional almost 1 in 5 are exaggerated by a factor of 4 or more. Again, it's not clear, is the publication biases just selecting out the papers that have lower estimates, or do people anticipate those publication biases and start to change how they do the analyses in order to get what referees and editors want? And so the next analysis was to look for fingerprints of selective reporting. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. There's one more point I wanted to make about the power issue. So I don't know if anybody saw this paper that came out in 2021 May, showing that non-replicable publications in a variety of social science fields are cited more than the replicable ones. But there's been lots of papers out there showing that the larger the effect size, the more citations a paper gets. And the problem is that a lot of those large effect size are probably not real. And so this is a major problem. And when we look at the agricultural economics papers, I can't say, because we don't know whether these papers will replicate or not, but the pattern I see is a little troubling to me in the sense that the most highly cited papers, the upper quartile, papers that are getting between 23 and almost 400 citations, their share of tests that are adequately powered is the smallest among all the publications that we've looked at so far. The most cited papers have the lowest share of adequately powered tests. And if you believe that there are publication biases in our field, that should be disturbing to us, that we are citing things that are very likely to be exaggerated. And if you believe what's happening in other fields, not replicable. All right, so backing up to what I had talked about the transition before, it's unclear whether or not it's just happening in the publication process. Things that are smaller effects that may not be statistically significant are not getting published, or whether researchers anticipate that pressure and adapt their behavior. So we want to look for fingerprints of whether there's selective reporting of statistically significant results. And so what we're doing here is we're plotting the 20,000 test statistics. We're turning them all into Z statistics for comparability. And we're looking for an unusual distribution of these test statistics around the conventional cutoff point for a p-value of 0.05. So Z statistic around 1.96. Right? So we're assuming large sample sizes, which is generally the case for most of econ, more than 100 observations. And looking at this graph, you should see something that's roughly smoothly monotonically increasing. That's what we would expect. Right now, the stuff in the right part of the tail, it's small samples, so you'll see more variation. But as you get closer to 0, it should be smoothly monotonically increasing. But if there's selective reporting, you'll see a double humped pattern where right around 1.96, there's this valley an unexpected absence or paucity of Z statistics. And when we look at the ag econ literature in these journals, we see that double humped pattern. You also can see, if you look a little far to the right, there's a little leveling off right around the Z statistics from P equals 0.01. It's not necessarily clear if that's more than you'd expect by chance, but that double hump pattern right after 1.96, it's hard to believe that's happening just by chance. And again, I'm not arguing that these papers are not going to be replicable. I'm just arguing that there's some fingerprints of that researchers are choosing to present their research in a more favorable light. And if they're underpowered designs and there's publication bias, then we've got this sort of toxic brew that lowers the credibility of our empirical evidence base. Right. The next thing we wanted to look at is one reason why you might see that unusual double hump pattern is that people are doing subgroup analyses, trying to find things that are either interesting because they find an average effect that's small and therefore uninteresting, or they're trying to extend their analysis, do more with the data. Not only do I measure an average parameter estimate, but then I estimate for different subgroups, and I've got some theories of why they might be different. The problem is if you keep doing multiple hypothesis testing with the same data, you're increasing the likelihood of false positives. And there's a large literature out there for thinking about how to mitigate those false positives, different ways of doing it. And I'm largely talking in the frequentist context for a lot of this, but the same issues that I'm talking about hold in the Bayesian context. You still have to deal with noisy data and extract a signal from noisy data. And even in the Bayesian literature, larger Bayes factors, smaller prediction intervals, these are all desirable attributes for papers, and therefore you have the same issues. And the same thing with multiple hypothesis testing. You've got to take into account all those multiple hypothesis tests in your calculation of posterior distributions. If you don't, then you're going to have problems. When we look at the literature, 68% of the studies in our sample conducted multiple hypothesis testing and reported them. This is the other issue, is that a lot of times people do a lot of tests and don't report the tests because they're uninteresting or maybe contradict or make the analysis look messy. I was just an editor on a PNAS issue, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science issue, where we had 6 randomized controlled trials. There were different papers, different countries, but all testing a similar intervention. They were all harmonized and pre-registered. And so they had to follow through in every test that was predetermined. They had to follow through and do it. And not surprisingly, sometimes the test gave conflicting answers. And boy, the referees really picked up on that and said, I don't know if we should publish this. There's some problems with this study that they're getting conflicting answers with the same data, rather than saying, well, reporting all these is good, and this sort of messy analysis might be what we normally get. So just looking at what people are reporting, we see that 2/3 of studies are doing multiple testing, but almost 0% are using an accepted approach to mitigate the multiple comparison problem. And so this again gives us some pause in terms of interpreting the evidence base that's in front of us. Not evidence that there's no replicability crisis, but evidence that there are practices being done that could certainly lead to one. All right, so just to summarize, before I get to what do we do about this, what do we find in this analysis? All right, that the empirical designs used by agricultural economists are often substantially underpowered, a feature that leads to unreliable estimated effect sizes. Even if you don't like the way we're doing the analysis, and you think there's some alternative methods or some of the assumptions are a little strong, it would be hard to give an explanation of how the data generating process works that would lead you to conclude that most designs are well powered in agricultural economics. Second, if we believe there are publication biases against statistically insignificant results, then these underpowered designs lead to the publication of exaggerated effect sizes. 3, we see the hallmarks of selective reporting in the ag econ literature. And again, if you think, wow, what's the big deal if it was really P.055 and they manipulated to get P.045, is that really a problem? If that's all it was, maybe not, right? But it's not clear, especially when we talk about these underpowered designs that are only going to give you statistical significance if you grossly exaggerated the effect size, that when you mix all these together, that it's innocuous. And then lastly, most studies engage in multiple hypothesis testing with no efforts to inhibit false positives. Right, so what do we do? Right, and I'm really targeting this at editors, reviewers, and funders, right, or the bosses at ERS, because it has to start at the top, because we've got two issues that are associated with the problem. First, misaligned incentives, right? The incentives for credible science, the incentives for professional advancement are not aligned. We're economists. It shouldn't be surprising that in a context where there are public benefits and private benefits, there may be a misalignment of the incentives. And that's what we work on, is trying to fix that problem and align those incentives. And that's largely what needs to be done. On top of that, we have a hidden information problem, an asymmetric information problem, whereby most of these choices by researchers are done in private. The people who read our publications or try to apply them don't see all the choices we make, what we choose to do, why we chose it, what we report, what we don't report. These have been called researcher degrees of freedom that can be used to turn exploratory analyses into confirmatory predefined analyses. And that has to be addressed. All right, so I don't have great solutions. I have some solutions that have been talked about by lots of other folks. So let's cover some of them. I mean, the first one I think is really important, is to change the norms in agricultural economics. Right? There should not be a referee report that we receive or that we write that said, I was really excited about this paper until I saw the results. That should not be how we evaluate papers. We should be emphasizing the designs and questions more and the results less. And in particular, we should stop expecting unrealistically large effect sizes. And if I tell somebody it's 1/10 of a standard deviation, we historically say, well, that's really small. That actually isn't for most policy contexts that are rigorously designed and pre-registered. And again, this has sort of been known. If you've never heard of Peter Rossi, coming out of the education field and evaluation, he has these metallic laws of evaluation, where the punchline is essentially, you shouldn't expect to see anything. That's the norm that you should be walking in expecting. And the better design your program, and he's talking about identification strategies, but this could easily be applied to some of the practices I'm going to discuss in the next slides, the more likely the effect is going to be small, close to zero. And when you look at companies that are running thousands of RCTs like Google and Microsoft, most of their studies, the vast majority, are not finding any statistically significant effect, and they're huge, well-designed, well-powered studies. They're not finding anything. All right. This has been shown in a lot of other behavioral randomized controlled trials that when they're replicated or scaled up, the estimated effect size is usually much smaller than prior published ones. This has been shown in the medical literature, where they call it the truth wears off. And that you see these effect sizes start to decline as people replicate a study, and the precision gets worse over time. Another thing we need to do is foster a culture of constructive criticism by incentivizing. We're a critical bunch. Anybody who's been to any of our seminars know we're a critical bunch, right? But we do not incentivize replications. There's no funding for them that I know of, and we don't make it easy to publish them. Now, I give credit to AEPP. It's got a special issue on replications coming up next year, but there's not a lot of windows for this kind of work, particularly if your replication shows that it replicates. People are like, that's not so interesting. And as long as we have that kind of culture, we're not going to be able to do a good job of determining how solid is our evidence-based. All right, those were sort of norms and culture. Now let's talk about some specific things that authors should do, but we're not going to do this until the editors, reviewers, and funders require it or encourage it or reward it. So the first one is pre-registration, which is getting controversial and mainly used for experimental ones, but I think definitely needs to be used for observational studies, maybe even more important in observational studies, because there's lots of degrees of freedom. If you don't know what a pre-registration or pre-analysis plan is, it means that you predefine what you're actually going to do and you post it in a public repository, timestamp, so people can see what were your original hypotheses, what were your original outcome variables, the treatment variable, your controls, any subgroups that you were going to look at and what hypotheses you had about them. And then you can change them, but it's making clear that you're differentiating what's confirmatory, that was predefined, and what came after seeing the results. And a lot of people said these pre-registrations are bad. They put too many constraints on researchers' degrees of freedom. They're certainly not costless, but those constraints are where their power comes from. You can certainly, and I've done this, where I say, I was stupid when I wrote that pre-registration plan. I didn't realize something, or I didn't realize until after I saw the data quality. You amend it, you change it. That's perfectly reasonable. But you put some constraints on yourself in the beginning because those constraints can matter. And I'm going to show you one figure. There's lots of figures like this. It's not a causal analysis. It's just a time series of years in which the National Institute's blocked for me, but it's a national, oh, there I see it. National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in the United States. These are randomized controlled trials that they funded from 1974 to 2014. And they're plotting the risk ratio. So a ratio of 1 means there's no effect. If it's below 1 means that the treatment reduced risk, which is generally what the medical trials want to do. A risk ratio above 1 means it increased the risk. That's undesirable. And they plot it based on the effect size and whether it was statistically significant. And the one thing you can see is that you're going along in the years, and most of these trials find statistically significant reductions in risk as a result of whatever interventions they're studying until 2000, when the effect sizes collapse around 1, and most of them are statistically insignificant. You see 2 that are statistically significant in the right direction and 1 that's in the undesired direction, right? Coincidentally, in year 2000, NHLBI required pre-registration, prospective registration, particularly of the primary outcomes. What are the outcomes you think this treatment is going to affect? And then you can put a bunch of secondary outcomes. You can come up with ones that you didn't think of before and you've explored them, but you made it clear what you thought this intervention should be affecting. And that simple change seems to have dramatically changed the conclusions that people are drawing from the field. It's not causal. Maybe, some people have argued that we've run out of all the good ideas. 20 years ago, we had the great ideas and that we don't have any good ideas anymore, or it's expensive to recruit subjects and therefore we have lower power, which is not the case in this. But there are lots of figures like this showing the same pattern, that after you require people to post publicly what they wanted to do, and a lot of times you can keep it private until you've published, and then it gets open to the public, but it's clearly time-stamped in the public repository. It says, we see the same pattern where the effect sizes collapse towards small effect sizes and the precision gets worse in the sense that we can't even differentiate whether it's 0 or not from the data. All right, some other things: encourage registered reports and result blind reviews. We're starting to see some more of this in econ, journal development economics, for example, doing registered reports. This is where you basically submit your article before you actually do the data analysis, and it's conditionally accepted or rejected, maybe through some revisions. And then when it comes back for a second review, it can only be rejected if you change the methodology or your plan so much that it's unidentifiable and it's no longer a good paper. But it can't be rejected based on the results. Some other fields do what's called results blind reviews, where the results are either masked or they're perturbed in some way with some noise. So this is done sometimes in cosmology, where that you only can look at the design and the questions and decide whether this is a good paper. You can't decide based on what the point estimate is or its sign or something like that. Another thing we need to do is encourage authors to report everything, and that's not going to work until we avoid punishing them for transparency. And too many times, referees use the transparency against the authors to say, well, but when they did this, it no longer looked as strong as it did in their main analysis. If your main analysis is pre-registered and you have these robustness checks that show not surprisingly, some noise and some uncertainty, people shouldn't get published for that. As long as they're punished for it, they're not going to do it. The third one is something people have been talking about for a lot. AJAE, I don't know about Ag Econ and food policy, I didn't look at them, but AJAE still has the asterisk on the tables. Most of the top science journals have gotten rid of this as a small step towards trying to get away from the cult of statistical significance. Right? Even confidence intervals and the Bayesian equivalents, they're not problematic free or problem free. People still wonder whether it covers zero or not, these intervals, but they get away from this. It's significant or it's not significant. It's up or it's down, or it's weak significance or strong significance. That we would treat a paper differently that has enormous confidence intervals that stop just before zero. That's a good paper, and a paper that has really tight confidence intervals that might include some negative values and some positive values, but mostly positive, we'd say that's not as good of a paper. Right? We need to stop doing that. I'm not sure why we still have this cult in Ag Econ, but it definitely seems to be there, and it's something people have talked about for decades in science and economics. And the last one, we've got to raise awareness, starting with the PhD students. So 2 years ago in the AEA conference, we gave, let's look at the time, we gave a workshop on these issues, and we did a survey at the very end, and we asked the tenured professors in the audience, of which there were about 14 out of maybe 45 people, 50 people in the audience. Would they recommend to their PhD student that they do all of these best practices in their dissertation and their publications? Fewer than 10% of the respondents said they would tell their PhD students or their postdocs to do all of these results. And when we did a discussion afterward, the answer was because it's costly for them to do it. They'd be at a disadvantage. If they did all these things and no one else in the field did these, they would be at a disadvantage in the job market and in the publication game. That's a terrible situation to be in, where the best practices of science, we can debate whether they're all best or how we ought to implement them, but things that are going to lead to more credible research are disincentivized in our field. We need to increase the returns to doing them. All right, so those were specific individual things, but we need systemic changes, I'm arguing. Again, I'm leaving editors, reviewers, and funders at the top, not authors, because it's got to come from the top. We need to change our norms about what high quality agricultural economics research should look like, right? And our expectations about what high quality agricultural economic studies can deliver, right? So, and these changes in norms and incentives have to come from the top. And I just close it, AEA has a bunch of sections. I don't know if the Europeans do, or the Australians, UK also have their association, or the International Association. But if they do, maybe we need a section that's dedicated to these particular issues. So I've thrown out one acronym, SORTA, Open, Reliable, and Transparent Agricultural and Applied Economics. SORTA, because it's sort of a good idea, not a great idea. But something where we can get a little more traction. Because again, we've been talking about this for years. And as far as we can tell, Pallavi and I, from looking at the recent publications in good journals, we still have these same problems throughout our evidence base. And maybe we need a dedicated group of individuals to start to get that to change, get at the top with editors, reviewers, funders, bosses in general. And with that, I'll end it. And thanks for your attention if you're all still out there.